Hello everyone, this is Chromý, and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use 2. In this presentation we will talk about language variation as a specific field of research. Specifically, we will discuss various approaches to the study of this phenomenon. In the study of language variation, we may ask four general questions. First, we may want to know whether there are any differences in the use of various linguistic units. For example, whether various groups of individuals use certain units differently than others, or whether specific individuals use particular units differently in different situations. Second, we may ask why do these differences actually exist, or how did these differences evolve? Third question is, how does language variation work, or how can we approach it and describe it? And the fourth question considers the consequences of language variation. We will deal with these four questions in this and the following presentations. Language use can vary from various perspectives. If you travel a lot or meet people from various regions, it must be clear to you that there are regional differences. For example, people speak differently in New York than in Texas. Regional variation is a topic of linguistic research already for a couple of centuries. What is also quite obvious are the stylistic differences. People change the way how do they speak, at least a little, depending on various factors. For example, you would probably use your native language differently if you would be speaking with your parents or friends than if you would be speaking with police officers or your teachers. A very important dimension in language variation is time. The way how a language is used is changing in time, both in a long run across several centuries and during a life of an individual. Last but not least, differences may also be social. Different people may differ in their use of a language, and this may be related to their age, gender, social class, ethnicity, and so on. In sum, language variation is a very complex topic. A very intriguing question is, why do these differences actually exist? Generally, we may say that it is a result of the historical development of a language, which is influenced by various factors. Among these, linguistic factors are important. For example, the role of frequency is often discussed in relation to language change. However, the social or demographic factors are also important. We can often hear that we live in our social bubbles. Among other things, this may influence the way how we speak and how our language use differs from other social bubbles. Last but not least, we may try to answer the general question, why do these differences exist, by relating language variation to identity. We may say that the way how we speak is narrowly related to the way how we form our identity. It is clear that it is possible to approach language variation from many different perspectives. If we try to model language variation in a certain situation, we always place our focus on certain aspects of the variation, whereas other aspects are rather neglected. It is similar to a paper model of a certain building. Some things are represented very precisely, some worse, and some aren't represented at all. In the study of language variation, we can generally distinguish between models which focus on the distribution of varieties. We call these models variety-based models. These models approach the language situation from a very broad perspective. On the other hand, there are also models which focus on the way how specific linguistic units or items are used. These models may be called item-based models. In the next presentation, we will focus on the variety-based models, but in the further presentations, we will discuss mostly the later type. Last question we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation is, what are the consequences of language variation? This is probably the most complicated one. It is for sure that language variation is a precondition for language change. If you took a course on language history, you know that language is constantly changing. However, these changes are not abrupt in the sense that all members of a speech community would agree that from a certain moment they will stop using certain linguistic item and they will start to use another item instead. On the contrary, language change is typically rather slow, and even in cases when the change happens quickly, we can see a certain period during this ongoing change when both units vary in their use. Another thing which is closely related to language variation are language attitudes. Because of language variation, it is possible to ascribe certain features as being improper, non-standard, or, on the other hand, prestigious. The use of particular units is then reflected in the general perception of the speaker by other speakers. Another consequence of language variation may be language shift. We talk about an ongoing language shift in situations when certain community ceases to use its language and adopts another language. This is typical for bilingual communities, but also for traditional dialectal communities, which may shift to a more broadly used regional standard from their traditional dialect. Last consequence of language variation we'll mention here is language, or rather communication accommodation. By accommodation, we mean a process when we change the way how we speak based on the way how our communication partner is speaking. We will return to all of these issues in the future presentations. This is all from me now. See you next time.